Pilgrims still stop at the plinth out of habit. The statue's face is a smear of stone, cheek and brow filed to an honest blankness, lips erased to a harmless line. Only the imperial aquila over the chest remains intact, patched with fresh gold leaf that catches the ash-flake light from guttering candles. The marble bears faint scorch crescents where litanies of sanctification once crackled, holy oils spattered, and incense resins burned down to black carbon stains. No one says the missing name. Older throats carry it like a lodged fishbone, while the young trace the shield rims with fingers and learn there was once a story here, and that it is forbidden. In the Imperium, saint and heretic are not moral opposites. They are entries on different lines of the same ledger, their columns maintained by different offices, their fates decided not by revelation, but by paperwork. To be raised is to be notarized. To be cast down is to be reclassified. The ecclesiarchy prints a halo when a quorum of clerks accepts sworn testimonia. The Ordo Hereticus seals a grave when 3 signatures dry on an edict of excommunicate traitoris. The categories catch them late or early, usually at the moment they offend a budget. Our evidentiary framework draws from the tools that rule memory. Ministorum canon law provides the language of sanctity, clauses defining miracles, tariffs for relic processions, quotas of incense for diocesan sieges. Ordo Hereticus writs reveal fear in cold phrases, designations of cognitive hazard, orders for narrative containment. Chapter chronicles offer day-by-day truth, written under oaths that could kill the writer. Between these official archives we collect what parchment cannot hold, whispers of dock serfs, songs of veterans, names murmured into cloaks lest they be heard by vox beads. In a side chapel 2 floors below the plinth sits a volume few pilgrims see. Chained to a brass rail and heavy as a man's chest, the penitent ledger serves as an audit register of wonders and obedience. Its pages marry piety to logistics with bureaucratic precision. Down one column, claimed miracles recorded by date and celebrant, bleeding icons staunched, fevers broken on saints' feast days, void storms parted after relic processions. Across from them, compliance figures, grain tithe percentages, promethium quotas, recruitment levies met or missed. Red ink marks discrepancies. Too many miracles against too few levies earns marginal notation, then inquiry, then visits from auditors who count both candles and shells. Sanctity in practice is monitored like production quotas. It must yield order and pay for itself. There exists a darker ledger, unwritten until required. The second death begins where excommunication ends. The first death claims flesh. The second removes the subject from history itself. After an edict, procedures move with efficiency that battlefield supply officers would envy. Statues receive facial amendments into anonymity. Sermonaries get new catechism inserts replacing names with generalities. A certain commander. Loyalist forces. Hagiographies are recalled and pulped, their inks boiled away for reuse. Family stipends freeze under suspicion of complicity. Battle honours detach from banners and transfer to units more suitable for public display. The work proceeds with bureaucratic methodism justified under survival rubrics. Heresy kills. Memory, the argument runs, serves as vector. We observe this argument made tangible in an administratum furnace room beneath the diocesan archive. Brass nameplates clatter down steel chutes, lettered histories, transformed into scrap by gravity and unsigned directives. A scribe in ash-grey gloves feeds them into crucible mouths, while tally adepts mark weights and alloys on slates. Heat turns words soft. Curled letters wrinkle, then slide into common brightness. Foundry servitors cast the mix into dull bars, then punch casings for artillery shells requisitioned by fronts that never see shrines. When those guns fire, they carry fragments of erasure across the void. No gunner knows they are supplied by forgetting. The machine closes on itself, wastes nothing that can be turned into obedience. What machinery selects which names fall down the chute, and how easily can the same hands that bless also unmake? The machinery that transforms memory into ammunition operates in reverse through an equally precise apparatus of systematic deification. While silent rooms process the erasure of inconvenient heroes, parallel chambers hum with the creation of new saints according to institutional specifications. The same clerks who lever brass nameplates from ledger spines also validate miraculous testimonia with identical bureaucratic precision. Understanding how the Imperium manufactures sanctity reveals why heroic destruction follows such predictable patterns, each saint crafted through processes that embed the mechanisms of their eventual unmaking. The office of canonization operates from chambers adjacent to the furnace rooms, its clerks wearing parchment cuffs that bear ink stains from processing both elevation writs and excommunication orders. Here, names are not erased, but minted through testimonia-gathering protocols that require sworn statements from 3 separate witnesses for each claimed miracle. The definition of miracle expands to encompass any victory achieved against mathematical probability, while hagiographer guilds reshape raw battlefield accounts into doctrinal inspiration through template phrases that convert tactical innovation into divine revelation. These narratives undergo mass production according to munitorum quotas that treat saint imagery as strategic resource requiring careful allocation across imperial territories. Chapter Master Thane of the Iron Skulls exemplifies the elevation of tactical competence into divine favor through careful documentation that transforms desperate improvisation into blessed insight. His coordination with unidentified auxiliaries during the Gehenna incursion became divine revelation of the Emperor's hidden servants in official accounts, while his tactical flexibility was reframed as unwavering adherence to the Emperor's true will. The Schola Progenium witness training programs teach survivors to perceive battlefield success through bureaucratic checklists that identify signs of divine intervention, their testimony following precise formats that emphasize miraculous elements while minimizing tactical explanations. These trained observers undergo months of preparation that calibrates their perceptions according to canonization requirements, learning to speak in canonical order: invocation, miracle, penance, result. Lord General Korath represents the transformation of competent logistics into sacred mystery through hagiographer guilds operating under ecclesiarchy charter with production quotas for inspirational literature. His efficient supply chain management during the Vanaheim siege became miraculous multiplication of ammunition in official records, while tactical retreats were reinterpreted as strategic prayers that drew enemies into the Emperor's trap. Quartermasters, forward tonnage figures with theological gloss, every crate becoming testament and every ration a blessing. The penitent ledger tallies miracle claims by regimental chaplains against levies delivered, red margins drawing auditors when effectiveness exceeds institutional comfort levels, according to mathematical precision that treats human excellence as expendable inventory. Living saints occupy the apex of systematic sanctity, their legends constructed through processes that convert effective leadership into supernatural manifestation. Saint Celestine's resurrections during the Third War for Armageddon were documented by trained observers whose sworn statements provided testimonial foundation for declarations inspiring millions while obscuring the mundane competence achieving actual victories. Hagiographers arrive with sketch plates before smoke clears, while ecclesiarchs debate metaphysics and the munitorum negotiates distribution rights for relics subdivided to the gram, their shards numbered, sealed, and dispatched to dioceses requiring morale boosts according to calculated saint-to-pilgrim ratios that maximize revenue while maintaining believable miracle frequency. Relic authentication requires lex mechanic assay through spectrographic analysis and gene print matching that verifies fragments against archival records, providing scientific validation for objects whose true value lies in symbolic inspiration rather than material composition. The same forge facilities manufacturing ammunition also cast saint medals according to specifications, ensuring consistent inspiration while minimizing production costs. Their production lines switching between bolter shells and blessed tokens according to sector requirements determined by administratum efficiency calculations. Pilgrimage taxes fund this apparatus through tithe collection, treating spiritual inspiration as taxable commodity, every offering contributing to vast economic engines sustaining constant sanctity production. Seals of verity provide bureaucratic validation through wax sigils, bearing cryptographic verification that prevents fraudulent testimony while creating administrative bottlenecks enabling institutional control over saint creation rates. The wax contains blessed oils and sacred resins, providing spiritual authentication, while embedded sigils enable tracking through imperial databases, monitoring miracle frequency and geographical distribution. Each seal requires authorization from 3 separate offices: Ecclesiarchy Doctrine, Verification, Administratum Resource Confirmation, and Inquisition Security Clearance, representing institutional investment in specific heroic narratives that must generate adequate return through inspiration and obedience. Silent notaries operate within this apparatus as unnamed clerks empowered to withhold validation without explanation or appeal, their anonymous authority enabling fine-tuned control over inspiration levels, preventing hero accumulation beyond institutional comfort zones. They review testimonia for political implications exceeding acceptable independence levels, flagging potential saints whose legends demonstrate dangerous competence or excessive personal loyalty among followers. Their sealed orders enable prevention of canonization through administrative delay rather than doctrinal rejection, creating plausible deniability while maintaining systematic control over hero creation rates. Systematic elevation isolates heroes from normal human relationships through transformation into symbols bearing impossible expectations. Chapter Masters discover tactical decisions interpreted as divine revelations, creating pressure to maintain impossible perfection while preventing admission of doubt or error. Guard generals find logistics expertise attributed to miraculous intervention, forcing acceptance of credit for divine favor rather than professional competence. Living saints become prisoners of their own legends, unable to express human emotions or acknowledge tactical failures without undermining inspiration. Their continued existence provides to millions of imperial citizens. Every word, gesture, and decision transforms from personal choice into sacred significance, creating profound psychological toll through living death preceding potential second death protocols. The apparatus creating saints maintains tools of unmaking in adjacent chambers, every seal of verity logged with retrieval procedures should clarification be required. Silent notaries keep records of approvals never written, their absence serving as administrative veto. Relic shards bear tracking ciphers routing them from altar to archive to furnace without public notice when institutional requirements demand spectacular demonstrations of doctrinal primacy. The same competence earning canonization during expansion periods merits excommunication during consolidation phases, administrative classification depending entirely upon institutional needs at evaluation moments. In a forward trench on Cadia Secundus, Guardsman Volk kisses a medal cast from blessed ceramite, its brass surface bearing Saint Celestine's stylized image according to approved iconographic specifications. The medal provides genuine inspiration enabling heroic sacrifice for imperial victory, demonstrating the saint-making engine's effectiveness at converting individual excellence into collective motivation through mass-produced sanctity. But recall orders have already been issued through silent notary channels, the saints' recent tactical innovations having exceeded acceptable independence parameters according to bureaucratic review protocols. The same forge casting his medal now prepares to melt recovered icons for reprocessing into ammunition, the eternal cycle continuing with mechanical precision that treats sanctity as renewable resource requiring careful management according to institutional mathematics rather than individual merit. What psychological toll does this systematic deification place on living heroes who discover their humanity sacrificed for institutional inspiration? And how does the same bureaucratic machinery elevating them to sainthood simultaneously prepare the administrative mechanisms that will eventually erase them from history? The machinery that creates saints also watches for their corruption. After the altars are raised and ledgers balanced, another apparatus awakens, the Watchers. Commissariat observation protocols and chaplain surveillance reports catalogue heroic deviation with the same methodical precision used to track supply quotas. The signs rarely begin with torn banners or changed colours. They manifest as quiet separations, commanders who stop dining with staff, captains absent from catechism recitations, lord generals whose after-action reports grow sparse on doctrine but abundant in personal rationale. These variances are logged under Form Theta 19, innocuous entries that accumulate until they shift subjects into amber watch status. Doctrinal questioning appears first in private correspondence. When pronouns multiply and liturgical phrasing thins in official communications, clerks in vox stations flag the packets. Lex mechanics compare margins to standard Tactica Imperialis glosses under seal of secrecy. A general who begins annotating sacred strategy with qualifiers like under local exigency or pending resource substitution advances another notch toward the red line. Among Astartes, chaplains test for doubt through ritual call and response. A brother who truncates the litany of hate to expedite arming rites saves seconds in wars measured by hours. Those seconds, multiplied across months, become evidence of priority shifts from institutional loyalty to mission-focused interpretation of orders. Resource hoarding proves easier to quantify. Munitorum audits track ammunition and fuel against allotments with accounting precision. When commanders retain crates for strategic reserves, the phrase itself serving as ritual protection, the numbers register their own discomfort. Patterns emerge, depots that never quite empty during crises, supply trains rerouted by local authorization, requisition slips stamped with seals absent from standard verification sheets. Each deviation represents payment on what we term the survival tax, incremental moral compromises imposed by resource scarcity and impossible orders. 3 cases illuminate the boundary between acceptable flexibility and heretical deviation. On Vanaheim Secundus, Chapter Master Korath displayed classic warning indicators during the Orc incursion: ammunition, hoarding beyond regulation limits, questioning orbital bombardment timing in encrypted communications, developing direct channels with Navy commanders that bypassed sector command. His chaplains documented 17 protocol violations over 6 months. Yet when compliance auditors arrived, Korath submitted to censure, redistributed stockpiled supplies, and returned to standard procedures. He pulled back through institutional submission, accepting demotion in exchange for continued service. The chapter retained its honor. The agri-world they had defended fell to the next wave. Lord General Mordian of the Cadian 203rd followed similar patterns during the Xerxes campaign, but responded to institutional pressure with defiance rather than compliance. He justified every deviation as mission-critical, developed ideological frameworks positioning institutional compliance as betrayal of the Emperor's true will, and began recruiting like-minded commanders. His fall required 18 months of siege warfare and cost 2 loyal regiments their strength. The contrast reveals transformation mechanics. Those who survive accept the survival tax through compartmentalization, maintaining institutional obedience while privately acknowledging systemic failures. The third case crossed over incrementally. Colonel Vex of the Mordian Iron Guard began by requisitioning extra Medicaid supplies through ecclesiarchy charity arms. When shipments failed, he seized spice tithe convoys to feed his troops, leaving promissory notes stamped with self-cut seals. He authored treatises on adaptive loyalty, arguing survival in the emperor's service sometimes opposed administratum obedience. When chaplains refused confession unless he renounced these texts, he refused them instead. Commissariat files show they prepared arrest orders, but higher officers paused intervention. Vex's regiment held a flank no replacements could manage. The file remained open while the survival tax compounded into larger rebellion. By the time auditors acted, Vex had declared autonomy and shot the commissar sent to arrest him. The Imperium's early warning systems create the conditions they monitor. Surveillance breeds paranoia. Observation protocols isolate heroes from natural support networks, transforming normal relationships into calculated performances. Heroes learn to distrust instincts, second-guess motivations, and view colleagues as potential informants. This isolation makes them vulnerable to the independent thinking surveillance seeks to detect. Commissariat files reveal disturbing patterns. Watchers often identify brewing heresy months before taking action. They document warning signs, track psychological progression, sometimes predicting rebellion with startling accuracy. Yet intervention rarely occurs during early stages when correction remains possible. Instead, surveillance continues until subjects commit unambiguous acts requiring execution as the only institutional response. The watchers know but wait, suggesting the system tolerates or encourages heroic falls for purposes not apparent in documentation. Why does the Imperium allow heresy to fester rather than intervene early? And what transforms survival adaptations into active rebellion? The Watchers document deviation but often wait because the Imperium itself manufactures the conditions requiring heretical choices. Imperial doctrine operates on theoretical perfection, every scenario anticipated, every response codified, every contingency addressed through millennia of accumulated precedent. Reality offers different mathematics. When sacred law meets battlefield necessity, heroes face impossible equations where obedience equals failure and success demands actions that merit execution. The gap between theory and practice becomes a killing ground where loyalty itself transforms into betrayal. Chapter Master Thane of the Iron Skulls encountered such mathematics during the Gehenna incursion. Chaos forces had breached the Mandeville Point in overwhelming numbers, their warp-tainted hulks disgorging demon engines across 3 shrine worlds. Standard doctrine demanded purification through orbital bombardment, civilian evacuation protocols, and systematic withdrawal to prepared positions. But the evacuation ships burned in orbit. Naval support was engaged elsewhere. The prepared positions existed only on charts drawn by cartographers who had never walked Gehenna's acid-scarred terrain. Thane's 3 companies faced annihilation unless they accepted aid from Eldar corsairs, already engaging chaos ground elements. The Codex Astartes provides clear guidance. Suffer not the alien to live. No exceptions, no tactical alliances, no shared objectives beyond mutual extermination. Yet Thane's astropathic communications with Sector Command yielded only repetitions of doctrine, while demon engines carved through refugee columns his forces were sworn to protect. He faced binary choice: follow orders and watch 3 worlds burn, or violate fundamental imperial law to achieve what he understood as the Emperor's true will. Thane chose Function over form. His librarians swore upon the catechism of abjuration before stepping into an inhuman corridor of cold starstone. His veterans fired bolters into warp-slick hulls, while Eldar lances whispered through void. The demon fleet died. The Eldar vanished. The chaplain delivered penances in a storm-battered chapel and filed reports omitting the word Eldar, substituting unidentified auxiliaries. The omission served as both sin and shield. On Corvinus Prime, Lord General Voss confronted different impossibility during the refugee crisis. His orders specified civilian protection as primary objective, military assets as secondary consideration. Standard doctrine demanded evacuation of population centers before engaging enemy forces, but Orc speed freaks had overrun the spaceports. Transport capacity existed for perhaps 1/3 of the population. Voss could save some civilians by abandoning others, or lose everyone attempting comprehensive evacuation. His staff calculated the mathematics. Partial evacuation meant condemning 2 million souls to certain death. Complete evacuation meant losing everyone when Orc reinforcements arrived before the process finished. Voss chose strategic triage disguised as tactical necessity. He evacuated essential personnel first through official channels, while quietly organizing remaining civilians into militia units positioned in urban strong points. His forces used civilian casualties as tactical advantages, allowing enemy units to become engaged in population centers where Imperial artillery could target them without concern for collateral damage. The strategy worked. Corvinus Prime held long enough for reinforcement fleets to arrive, but Voss had transformed civilians into ammunition, violating every protection protocol in Imperial law. His after-action report termed the dead necessary losses under total war rubric. The commissariat countersigned with notation, excess zeal noted, further review pending. Inquisitor Vex faced the purest equation during the Tertius heresy investigation. Her mandate demanded truth above all considerations, heresy purged regardless of cost. Standard procedure required full-scale exterminatus when chaos corruption exceeded containment thresholds. But her investigation revealed the heresy originated from Adeptus Mechanicus experiments authorized by the sector governor under sealed orders from Terra itself. Following protocol meant destroying evidence of high-level complicity, allowing identical corruption to spread through other sectors. The heresy could be contained through surgical elimination of key figures, preserving the subsector while removing the infection. Such precision violated Inquisition doctrine, demanding absolute purification. Vex chose scalpel over hammer. She eliminated corrupted tech priests, seized their research, and leveraged the sector governor's complicity rather than exposing his involvement. Her methods preserved 17 billion lives and contained heretical knowledge for further study, yet she had violated core Inquisition principles: mercy over purity, political calculation over doctrinal absolute, preservation over purification. Her greatest success required embracing flexibility that Inquisition training specifically forbade. Between such acts and their paperwork lives an unwritten doctrine officers call the flexibility protocols. These consist of bureaucratic blind spots understood as gifts, non-reporting windows during warp storms, variance writs issued by compliant munitorum clerks who misplace authorization keys at convenient hours, rogue traders who sign as contracted logistics rather than Xenos liaison. Code phrases creep into Vox traffic. The wind is veering. Signals doctrinal deviation. Candlemaker's variance indicates resource reallocation. Report deferred for clarity. Warns trusted peers that standard procedures must bend or break. These networks allow heroes to achieve objectives while maintaining institutional deniability. Psychological pressure accumulates as heroes discover their greatest victories require actions that would normally merit execution. Each impossible choice extracts payment on the survival tax, building moral debt that eventually demands larger compromises to service. Heroes learn to compartmentalize, maintaining public orthodoxy while privately acknowledging that effectiveness requires heretical flexibility. Success becomes its own corruption when achievement demands violating the principles that created the achiever. The foundation for larger betrayals emerges from this recognition. Heroes who successfully navigate impossible orders develop confidence in their judgment over institutional wisdom. They begin interpreting doctrine rather than following it, seeking the emperor's true will rather than accepting bureaucratic interpretation. How do informal command networks enable coordinated resistance to imperial doctrine, and what determines when the Imperium stops tolerating necessary flexibility? The flexibility protocols that enable necessary victories extract their own price from those who employ them. After triumph achieved through doctrinal bending, the machinery shifts from gratitude to risk assessment. Heroes discover that success itself becomes a corrupting force within imperial hierarchies, not through moral decay, but through the accumulation of independent power that threatens established structures. Each impossible victory isolates them further from the systems that created them, transforming effectiveness into liability and competence into hazard. Victory syndrome manifests through predictable administrative symptoms documented in commissariat behavioral files. Triumphant commanders find their success threatening established power structures, generating institutional responses designed to contain rather than celebrate their achievements. Honors arrive embedded with penalties. Public lauds pair with reassignments to quiet sectors where heroic reputations cannot grow. Supply allotments normalize as soon as banners are furled, requisition approvals lengthening from days to quarters through bureaucratic friction that feels accidental but follows consistent patterns. Chapter: Master Thane returned from Gehenna to audits instead of accolades. His victory over the Daemon fleet earned him expanded scrutiny rather than expanded authority. Relic vaults underwent inventory, his librarius faced questioning about anomalous alliances, and his chapter's void rights on patrol lanes were suspended pending review. Ammunition shipments arrived partially fulfilled, with notes citing sector-wide shortfalls contradicted by dockside manifests showing adequate supplies diverted to less successful commanders. Brothers who had bled at Thane's side found themselves rotated to distant crusades under the banner of unity, a euphemism for dilution of personal followings that might threaten institutional hierarchy. The Imperium does not leave such management to chance. Laureate caps limit the number of citations a commander may receive per campaign before the Office of Canonization defers further recognition pending cycle review. Command rotation edicts require triumphant leaders to shift theaters within defined spans, officially to prevent stagnation, practically to disperse personal loyalties before they solidify into independent power bases. Resource normalization tables scale down emergency allotments to pre-crisis baselines regardless of ongoing conditions. Silent notaries withhold seals of verity that would convert battlefield success into canonized sanctity, keeping legends provisional and therefore controllable. Material consequences compound political isolation. Successful commanders control larger resource flows as their operational scope expands, attracting civilian contractors, minor nobles, and forge interests eager to trade utility for influence. They gain access to restricted technologies under temporary dispensations that extend their reach beyond institutional comfort. Archaeotech shells, forbidden Auspex filters, auxiliary servitor cadres that make them less dependent on central supply chains. Personal loyalty accumulates among troops who remember which commander kept them alive when doctrine would have killed them. Veterans develop bonds that transcend institutional hierarchy, following personal authority rather than abstract imperial command. The psychological pressure builds as heroes realize their greatest achievements mark them for institutional containment rather than advancement. They learn the lesson the machine keeps teaching: obedience risked worlds, effectiveness earned punishment. Rational response demands securing means that cannot be easily revoked. Supply caches, off-ledger, logistics charters not subject to sector seals, private codes, chapels where doctrine is interpreted rather than recited. What begins as insurance against institutional caprice looks, from above, like ambition. From below, it looks like survival. Thane responded to each curtailment with colder independence. He established forward magazines outside standard registries, cultivated favors with rogue traders whose contracts could be explained as civilian freight, and developed communication networks that bypassed sector command. His actions remained technically within regulations while building operational autonomy that made oversight increasingly difficult. The same competence that saved 3 shrine worlds now threatened the hierarchies those worlds served. The Imperium fears its own champions almost as much as external enemies, creating conditions where loyalty itself becomes suspect when it proves too effective. Institutional memory carries warnings of heroes who became warlords, saviors who became tyrants, champions whose competence exceeded their controllability. This fear generates management policies that often create the very threats they seek to prevent, pushing capable individuals toward defensive rebellion through systematic isolation and limitation. How does institutional fear of success manifest in the next layer of hero management policies? And what finally drives victorious servants to seek independence from creators who insist upon tightening leashes around those who save them? The mechanisms that isolate successful heroes find their most documented expression in the transformation of Luft Huron, chapter master of the Astral Claws and warden of the Maelstrom Zone. His progression from exemplary servant to the tyrant of Badab demonstrates how victory syndrome, when combined with institutional neglect and impossible operational requirements, transforms rational adaptation into existential rebellion through a series of seemingly justified escalations. Huron's case provides the clearest evidence that the Imperium's hero management failures create the very threats they purport to prevent. Huron embodied imperial martial virtue for 8 centuries. The Astral Claws maintained 18 fortress monasteries across the Maelstrom Zone, operated patrol fleets that kept crucial shipping lanes viable, and tithed resources according to administratum schedules despite operating in conditions that made standard supply chains impossible. Commissariat efficiency ratings from Huron's early decades show only exemplary marks and commendations for tactical innovation that exceeded sector averages. His chapter's gene seed purity remained unmarked by deviation. Their battle honors filled 3 parchment rolls. The machine had created a perfect servant for an imperfect posting. The Maelstrom itself provided the first corrupting pressure. Warp storms erupted without warning, swallowing convoys and spitting out debris months later in systems light-years distant. Pirates emerged from impossible angles, their hulls twisted by energies that made conventional pursuit futile. Standard Imperial doctrine assumed predictable supply lines and reinforcement schedules. The Maelstrom laughed at such assumptions, demanding constant adaptation and resource flexibility that central planning could not accommodate. Initial frustration emerged from administratum responses that treated the Maelstrom as a standard sector rather than an active war zone. Priority convoys arrived months late or not at all, their escorts diverted to sectors where bureaucrats faced less paperwork risk. Requisitions for specialized void shields and warp-resistant hull plating disappeared into processing queues, while pirates struck merchant fleets using captured Imperial vessels. Huron's requests for additional chapter support received form responses, citing resource constraints and strategic priorities that ignored the zone's unique operational requirements. The decision to retain imperial tithes for Maelstrom defense marked Huron's first step toward heretical independence. Standard procedure demanded forwarding all collected resources to Sector Command for redistribution according to administratum priorities determined by clerks who had never seen a warp storm. Convoy losses meant materials sent away rarely returned, while immediate threats required immediate response. Huron began withholding percentages of collected tithes, initially small amounts justified as emergency reserves, gradually expanding to comprehensive resource retention documented with meticulous tactical rationale that made each decision appear reasonable in isolation. Our analysis of 3 centuries of frontier conflicts reveals the tithe-war ratio. For every sustained 5% shortfall in war material tithes over 6 standard years, heresy prosecutions in affected sectors increase by a factor of 4 within the following decade. The correlation holds across Orphean, Maelstrom, and Ghoul Star's peripheries, suggesting mathematical inevitability rather than moral failure. Regions experiencing supply deficits exceeding 30% of baseline requirements show heresy rates approaching statistical certainty. The Maelstrom Zone, operating at 47% of recommended resource levels for over 2 centuries, represented not aberrant corruption, but predictable institutional breakdown. Territorial expansion followed logically from resource retention. The Astral Claws could not effectively defend the Maelstrom from fixed positions when threats emerged from warp storms that shifted location unpredictably. Huron established forward bases on worlds nominally outside his chapter's mandate, initially as temporary staging areas, eventually as permanent installations that provided strategic depth and independent resource access. Each expansion received post-facto justification through tactical success. Bases that intercepted pirate raids before they reached core worlds, mining operations that supplied materials for defensive construction, recruitment from populations grateful for protection against warp-spawn incursions. The Maelstrom's warp influence provided both opportunity and subtle corruption. Psychic emanations gradually altered the Astral Claw's perspective on imperial authority, while warp storms made astropathic communications unreliable, creating information isolation that made Huron's chapter increasingly dependent on its own judgment. Veterans who had fought in the Maelstrom for decades developed loyalty to their chapter master that superseded abstract imperial command, viewing him as the only authority who understood their unique sacrifices and operational realities. Allied chapters accumulated through shared necessity and mutual isolation. The Mantis warriors faced similar supply shortfalls in adjacent sectors. The Lamenters carried censure from previous campaigns that made them desperate for redemption through effective service. The Executioners had been marginalized by political disputes with other imperial institutions. Huron offered these chapters what the Imperium withheld: reliable support, shared resources, and recognition for their sacrifices. Flexibility protocols expanded from individual chapter adaptations to coordinated resistance networks that enabled systematic circumvention of impossible orders through bureaucratic blind spots. Political machinations isolated Huron from potential imperial allies through systematic character assassination and bureaucratic obstruction. Sector Governor Militant Ortega viewed Huron's success as implicit criticism of his own administration. Inquisitor Locke interpreted Huron's independence as evidence of potential corruption. Naval commanders resented Huron's void superiority in the Maelstrom. These institutions coordinated to present Huron as a problem requiring solution rather than an asset requiring support, creating the isolation that pushed pragmatic adaptation toward defensive rebellion. Specific moments existed where Huron could have stepped back through institutional submission. When the administratum demanded full accounting of retained resources, acceptance of censure might have preserved his position. When Sector Command ordered withdrawal from forward bases, compliance would have meant strategic disadvantage but continued legitimacy. Each decision point offered survival through subordination at the cost of effectiveness. Huron chose function over form, mission over hierarchy, results over relationships, until return became impossible without accepting the destruction of everything he had built to serve the Emperor's will. What role did imperial politics play in forcing Huron's final transformation, and how did other chapters respond when the crisis in the Maelstrom demanded that sides be chosen? Imperial politics forced Huron's hand through the machinery designed to manage heroic deviation, a three-headed apparatus that transforms pragmatic adaptation into existential rebellion through institutional momentum and bureaucratic face-saving. When successful commanders accumulate independent power, the Imperium responds not with tactical assessment but with political calculation that prioritizes precedent over effectiveness. The cure becomes worse than the disease as institutional preservation supersedes operational necessity, creating the very crises the system claims to prevent. The Senatorum Imperialis evaluated Huron through political mathematics rather than military merit. Sector Governor Militant Ortega's reports emphasized territorial expansion and resource retention while minimizing defensive victories and piracy suppression rates. The Senate's calculations centered on systemic implications. Allowing one chapter master to retain tithes and expand territory would encourage similar adaptations throughout the Imperium, potentially fragmenting central authority into feudal power structures. Their institutional logic demanded making an example that would discourage independence regardless of tactical justification. Political survival required demonstrating that success without submission carried consequences more severe than failure with obedience. The Ordo Hereticus approached Huron's case through threat assessment that treated competence as corruption. Inquisitor Locke's analysis documented warp exposure among the astral claws, alliance building that suggested political rather than military motivations, and resource independence that exceeded acceptable parameters for chapter operations. The Ordo's analytical framework assumed loyal servants would accept inefficiency rather than develop autonomous capability, making effectiveness itself suspicious when it bypassed central control. Their institutional bias viewed Huron's success as evidence of dangerous deviation rather than necessary adaptation, interpreting his victories as proof of corruption rather than competence. The Departamento Munitorum evaluated Huron through supply chain security rather than battlefield results. Their analysis treated retained tithes as theft regardless of tactical justification, viewing forward bases as unauthorized resource drains that complicated logistics planning. The department's institutional priorities emphasized predictable resource flows over tactical flexibility, making Huron's adaptations appear as systemic threats to imperial war economy rather than responses to operational requirements. Their recommendations focused on resource recovery and supply chain normalization without addressing the conditions that had necessitated Huron's innovations in the first place. These competing assessments converged in the conclave triune, the bureaucratic mechanism requiring coordinated signatures for excommunicate traitoris declarations. The system balances ecclesiarchy doctrine, administratum efficiency, and Inquisition security concerns through a process designed to prevent hasty condemnations while ensuring institutional consensus. Ecclesiarchy representatives evaluate doctrinal purity through adherence to oath and tithe obligations. Administratum delegates assess administrative compliance through resource flow analysis and territorial authority verification. Inquisition agents analyze corruption risk through behavioral pattern assessment and loyalty metrics. All three signatures are required for excommunication, creating institutional momentum that makes reversal increasingly difficult as each body commits credibility to the process. The conclave's deliberations regarding Huron stretched across 18 months of escalating institutional commitment. Initial censure recommendations expanded to territorial restrictions when Huron continued operations during the review period. Resource embargoes followed when he refused to halt expansion pending final judgment. Naval interdiction was authorized when he seized tithe convoys for safekeeping. Each escalation represented institutional face-saving rather than tactical necessity, as bureaucratic momentum transformed negotiable disagreements into existential conflicts where compromise became impossible and total victory or defeat the only acceptable outcomes. Bureaucratic momentum accelerated as each institution invested credibility in Huron's condemnation. The Senatorum could not retreat without appearing weak on territorial integrity, encouraging similar independence movements across frontier sectors. The Ordo Hereticus could not reverse course without admitting analytical failure, undermining their threat assessment credibility. The Departamento Munitorum could not compromise without establishing precedents for resource retention that would destabilize supply chain planning throughout the Imperium. Institutional logic demanded escalation rather than resolution, transforming administrative disputes into doctrinal conflicts requiring military solutions. The response apparatus itself became part of the problem as institutional preservation superseded tactical effectiveness. Naval assets were diverted from anti-piracy operations to enforce embargoes against Huron's forces, allowing actual pirates to exploit the security gap. Guard regiments received deployment orders for conflicts that had not yet begun, stripping defenses from sectors facing genuine external threats. Chapter recall notices went out to Allied forces before diplomatic solutions had been attempted, forcing commanders to choose sides based on institutional pressure rather than tactical assessment. The machinery of response created the crisis it purported to address, making Huron's defensive preparations appear as aggressive mobilization and his alliance building look like rebellion coordination. Political face-saving transformed local problems into galactic crises as each institution escalated rather than admit error or oversight. The Senatorum's territorial concerns became constitutional crises requiring military intervention to preserve imperial unity. The Ordo's corruption suspicions became heresy investigations demanding total purification regardless of collateral damage. The Munitorum's resource disputes became supply chain security issues requiring systematic enforcement across multiple sectors. What began as administrative disagreement over tithe collection procedures evolved into the Badab War through institutional momentum that made de-escalation impossible without unacceptable loss of bureaucratic credibility. The machinery designed to provide measured responses instead created conditions where management became warfare. Each institution's need to demonstrate effectiveness through decisive action prevented the quiet compromises that might have preserved both Huron's loyalty and imperial authority. How do institutional responses transform manageable problems into existential crises? And what happens when the response apparatus itself becomes the primary threat requiring response? The response apparatus transformed administrative disagreement into total war when the Badab Task Force translated bureaucratic momentum into naval deployment. Strike cruisers that had once coordinated against Xenos raiders now targeted each other with weapons designed to kill aliens, not Astartes. The Lamenter's battle barge exchanged broadsides with Firehawk's vessels, while their crews screamed identical litanies across Vox channels that had carried coordination protocols months before. Plasma drives burned at emergency settings, writing epitaphs across the void as ships died not for the Emperor's glory, but for institutional precedent. Huron's informal networks activated as the flexibility protocols expanded into desperate coordination systems. Encrypted communications passed between Allied fleets through channels the Imperium had never monitored because it had never imagined they would be necessary. the Mantis warriors recognized their own potential fate in Huron's condemnation. The executioners carried grudges against the very institutions now demanding destruction. Code phrases flickered through the static. Candlemakers' variants became artillery coordinates. Report deferred for clarity. Signaled retreat routes through asteroid fields the astral claws had mapped during centuries of maelstrom patrol. On Badab Primaris below, street-to-street fighting demonstrated the psychological breaking point where doctrine collapsed into horror. In a manufactorum district, Brother Sergeant Carax of the Astral Claws faced Battle Brother Theron of the Minotaurs across a conveyor belt, still moving with mechanical indifference, carrying half-assembled bolter shells between warriors who had trained on distant worlds decades before. Their weapons spoke in unison, mass reactive rounds designed for Orcs and Eldar, instead tearing through ceramite that bore identical gene seed in different colors. The conveyor continued its cycle, carrying blood-spattered ammunition between corpses that wore the same Imperial aquila. Resource scarcity shaped every tactical decision as the tithe-war ratio manifested like a law of physics. Both sides fought not just for territorial control, but for access to munitions factories and promethium refineries. The Astral Claws defended supply depots with the desperation of forces who knew defeat meant complete erasure. Loyalist forces attacked with equal fury, understanding that failure would validate dangerous precedents of independence. Survival taxes accumulated as ammunition discipline tightened to ritual precision, and apothecaries mixed coagulants from reclaimed chemicals. Every crate seized translated into another company committed to the fight, the mathematical correlation between resource shortfalls and violence intensity playing out with bureaucratic precision. The climax arrived in the Palace of Thorns, where Huron led the defense personally, through corridors lined with banners celebrating 8 centuries of loyal service. Loyalist terminators breached the outer defenses through coordinated orbital bombardment that reduced architectural marvels to rubble fields. In the throne room entrance, a melter blast caught Huron directly, searing away half his face and most of his torso in a flash that turned air to plasma. The pain did not break him, but forged him into something new. As his apothecaries dragged his ruined form to evacuation shuttles, the transformation from loyal servant to independent warlord completed itself in burned flesh and mechanical augmentation. The Red Corsair was born from the Imperium's fear of its own champions. Parallel to Huron's physical destruction, the second death machinery activated with bureaucratic efficiency that required no pause for battle outcomes. In Archive Station Tertius, silent notaries removed brass nameplates from chapter records under sealed orders. Huron's victories against Hive Fleet Kraken were attributed to Loyalist Space Marine forces in revised battle accounts. His tactical innovations were credited to classified Imperial assets in strategic manuals. Hagiographers received pulping orders for texts mentioning the Astral Claws, while foundries prepared to melt recovered heraldry into shell casings. The same competence that had made him exemplary now served rebellion as evacuation craft lifted survivors toward stolen ships. Resource tallies revealed the full cost of institutional inflexibility. 18 Space Marine chapters participated, with 4 declared excommunicate traitoris. Naval losses included 47 capital ships and over 300 escorts. Guard casualties exceeded 2 million across 17 deployment zones. The economic impact included 17 industrial worlds lost and shipping lanes disrupted for decades. The Imperium had spent more resources destroying one affected defender than Huron had ever retained from tithe obligations, transforming manageable administrative disagreement into galactic catastrophe through bureaucratic momentum that prioritized precedent over pragmatism. The Badab War established that institutional hero management creates the very threats it claims to prevent. The machinery designed to contain successful commanders instead manufactured the Red Corsair, a pirate lord whose intimate knowledge of imperial weaknesses would plague shipping lanes for millennia. Others watched from distant sectors, taking notes on the arc from warden to corsair, learning that effectiveness without submission carried consequences more severe than failure with obedience. What lessons did the Imperium learn from this demonstration of self-inflicted catastrophe, and how do other potential heretics interpret Huron's example as they face their own impossible choices between loyalty and survival? The lessons the Imperium learned from Badab were administrative rather than strategic, focused on perfecting erasure rather than preventing rebellion. While debris still cooled in the void above Badab Primaris, the second death protocols activated with mechanical precision across 17 sectors. The rite of unmaking began before the last guns fell silent, transforming heroic memory into institutional non-existence through processes refined by millennia of systematic forgetting. Silent rooms operate in windowless administratum chambers where the sound is metallic rain. Brass nameplates are levered from ledger spines with specialized tools, dropping into collection hoppers with rhythmic precision that echoes through spaces designed for acoustic isolation. Each plate bears identity etched in high Gothic script, name, rank, deed summary, requiring artisan hours to create but seconds to remove. The indentations left behind are smooth, unmarked, as if the names had never existed. Scrivener Adept Vex begins her shift at the 7th bell, entering Silent Room Tertius through blast doors that seal with hydraulic finality. Her workstation contains 3,000 volumes requiring Huron erasure, their spines marked with crimson authorization seals. The rubric of denial provides template language for each category of replacement. Chapter Master Luft. Huron led the defense of Ammendorf becomes Loyalist forces successfully repelled Xeno's incursions. Tactical innovations transform into standard imperial doctrine. Personal leadership dissolves into collective imperial valor. Her stylus moves with practiced efficiency, converting individual achievement into institutional abstraction through bureaucratic alchemy. The planted elements from earlier chapters bear systematic fruit. Seals of verity face recall across the Maelstrom zone, as ecclesiarchy auditors collect wax sigils that had validated Astral Claw's miracles over 8 centuries. Each seal represents sworn testimony of impossible victories and divine interventions. The wax melts in sanctified furnaces while replacement seals are prepared for attribution to classified loyalist assets in revised accounts. Silent notaries activate to invalidate previous miracle claims, issuing writs that retroactively withdraw validation without explanation or appeal. The penitent ledger undergoes comprehensive recalculation as miracle to tithe ratios are adjusted to erase statistical anomalies. Victory rates that exceeded sector averages are redistributed to other units through mathematical revision. Casualty figures suggesting divine favor are normalized to baseline projections. The ledger's arithmetic must balance perfectly, showing no evidence that Huron's resource retention had actually improved operational effectiveness. Numbers that once justified sainthood consideration vanish into recycling furnaces along with the brass plates that bore them. Material consequences ripple outward through administrative channels. Families connected to the Astral Claws face bureaucratic orphaning as pensions freeze under Heresy Association protocols. Widows discover their husbands retroactively classified as traitors whose service never qualified for imperial benefits. Children lose educational stipends and housing allowances, their fathers' medals recalled for melting into ammunition. Oaths sworn to the astral clause require formal retraction and replacement, creating legal orphans whose previous allegiances never officially existed. Vex processes these human costs with methodical attention. Dependency files undergo revision as family connections to excommunicated forces are severed through legal mechanisms that leave no avenue for appeal. Housing assignments transfer from military to civilian administration, reducing quality while increasing cost. Medical care shifts from veteran priority to general population queues. Each adjustment represents another life altered by institutional memory management. Families punished for associations the state now claims never existed. Physical destruction requires industrial coordination, as recycling furnaces across 17 sectors receive brass shipments, marked only with processing codes. Nameplates melt alongside medal citations and ceremonial engravings in crucibles that transform identity into raw materials for shell casings. The same metals that once proclaimed heroic deeds will carry explosive charges against enemies who never knew they were fighting recycled memory. The cycle closes on itself, wasting nothing that can serve institutional needs. One fragment resists on Vex's desk, a marginal note recording a nameless serf's warning that saved a boarding party. The handwriting is swift, the ink cheap, the voice alive in its brevity. No rubric addresses anonymous heroism. Vex hesitates long enough to earn a glance from her partner, then sets the stamp anyway. The note becomes Crew Initiative Noted. The hesitation, like the name it might have protected, has no field in any ledger. Institutional memory operates as weaponry exceeding any bolter's precision, targeting not just individuals, but the possibility of learning from their examples. By erasing successful adaptations along with their creators, the second death ensures future commanders cannot study effective responses to impossible situations. The system preserves its own failures while eliminating evidence of alternatives, maintaining precedent through systematic amnesia that prevents evolution or improvement. How do people cope when their heroes are retroactively unmade? And what underground networks preserve forbidden memories that official channels systematically destroy? Underground networks preserve forbidden memories through methods that mirror the erasure apparatus in reverse, but the Imperium's primary response to successful erasure was systematic expansion of control rather than memory preservation. Badab proved that second death protocols worked, encouraging their application across all imperial institutions through comprehensive policy restructuring. The lesson drawn was administrative rather than strategic. Independence breeds catastrophe. Catastrophe demands surveillance. Surveillance justifies expanded control. Where archives once memorialized exceptions, they now prefaced prohibitions through standing orders that converted a single war into galactic governance template. Chapter oversight underwent the most immediate and comprehensive restructuring. Chaplain rotations became mandatory on fixed 18-month cycles, preventing the accumulation of personal loyalties around charismatic leaders that had enabled Huron's alliance network. No chaplain could serve with the same chapter for more than 2 decades, ensuring spiritual guidance remained institutionally loyal rather than personally devoted. Mandatory administratum liaisons embedded permanently within fortress monasteries, their remit framed as logistical harmonization but practiced as continuous audit. These liaisons carried sealed orders empowering them to countermand chapter master decisions under heresy suspicion protocols, creating dual command structures where bureaucratic compliance superseded tactical effectiveness. Tithe collection procedures transformed from negotiable obligations into rigid mathematical requirements through graduated penalty systems. The previous binary structure of tithe met or missed was replaced with automated enforcement mechanisms that throttled fuel, ammunition, or medical supplies in precise bands, rather than severing supply lines completely. Resource allocation transparency appeared in quarterly reports, providing curated evidence of fairness while enabling comparative analysis that identified statistical outliers. Behind the administrative rhetoric, the penitent ledger's algorithms evolved from post-mortem analysis to early warning systems, flagging commanders whose miracle claims rose faster than their levy compliance according to the tithe-war ratio mathematics. Enhanced surveillance of successful commanders hardened from informal practice to codified doctrine through performance caps and mandatory rotation policies. No commander could exceed baseline effectiveness metrics by more than 15% without triggering comprehensive review protocols. Mandatory rotation requirements limited any officer's tenure in a given theatre to 5 standard years, substituting institutional continuity for personal expertise. Laurel quotas capped public recognition after 3 major citations, with the Office of Canonization deferring further announcements through prudential pacing language. Silent notaries gained standing authority to withhold seals of verity on battlefield testimonia deemed contextually ambiguous, a phrase covering any achievement accomplished through flexibility protocols. These modifications crystallized into what internal documents diagnosed as Badab syndrome, institutional paranoia triggered by proximity to excellence. Symptoms included reflexive resource embargoes following spectacular results, sudden emphasis on obedience liturgies over tactical innovation, and displacement of experienced staff with doctrinal purists. The syndrome became the quiet diagnosis scribbled in audit margins, shaping hero management decisions through presumption of guilt that required constant proof of loyalty rather than evidence of capability. Scholar Progenium curricula incorporated the war as cautionary modules, training future officers to equate adaptation with risk and effectiveness with potential corruption. Other heroes witnessed Badab's outcome and drew survival lessons that prioritized institutional safety over operational effectiveness. Chapter Master Mordrak of the Silver Skulls learned that competence without submission carried consequences more severe than failure with obedience, beginning to store emergency supplies in pilgrim shrines beyond munitorum inventory while writing reports in pious generalities that concealed decisive innovation. Lord General Voss of the Krieg 143rd refused a tactical alliance with Tau auxiliaries that would have saved an agri-world, choosing compliance over survival as the system fell, and his obedience earned citation and reassignment to a quieter sector. Inquisitor Kex, measuring demon cult contagion, chose orbital bombardment over surgical elimination, remembering how precision had been interpreted as dangerous independence in Huron's case. The war economy absorbed substantial new costs as forge lines retooled to produce standardized heraldry kits that could be reissued after purges, replacing unit iconography with approved generics to minimize future erasure expenses. Pilgrimage taxes increased to fund expanded audit staff, while dioceses introduced tiered indulgences promising prayers for compliant valor. Morale shifted at squad level as medals arrived slower and citations read like legal disclaimers protecting institutions rather than honoring individuals. Black markets for rescinded relics flourished as discarded icons, pried from pulped banners, circulated as contraband among veterans who refused systematic forgetting. Badab's legacy settled as atmospheric pressure in every institutional duct, distrust ritualized at scale. The system learned to fear what it required to survive, while those tasked with salvation learned to hide or deliberately blunt the skills that might save worlds. Performance caps drove capable commanders toward deliberate mediocrity to avoid review triggers. Rotation policies prevented the regional expertise necessary for effective frontier defense. Surveillance requirements consumed resources that could have addressed the supply shortfalls driving rebellion in the first place. Each modification addressed Huron's symptoms while strengthening the underlying conditions that had created him, ensuring future rebellions would follow similar patterns with mathematical inevitability. The Imperium had perfected erasure while systematically preventing the tactical innovations that might reduce the need for erasure. Badab syndrome became self-perpetuating institutional momentum, generating the very threats it claimed to prevent through oppressive weight that transformed survival adaptations into suspicious behaviors. Which current heroes show Badab-like warning patterns under these enhanced surveillance protocols? And how has increased monitoring fundamentally altered the nature of Imperial heroism itself? Current heroes displaying Badab-like warning patterns exist throughout Imperial hierarchies, but the most dangerous deviations emerge within the surveillance apparatus itself. Badab syndrome seeps upward into the only institution nominally beyond audit, the Inquisition. Here, the same paranoia that transforms competent commanders into institutional threats creates even more catastrophic failures. The Watchers themselves require watching, yet their absolute authority and intimate knowledge of Imperial weaknesses make them the most dangerous heretics when they fall. The Imperium's ultimate guardians become its greatest threats precisely because their mandate demands employing the very methods they condemn in others. The Inquisition's unique position creates perfect conditions for corruption through daily exposure to forbidden knowledge, isolation of absolute authority, and moral compromises disguised as operational necessity. Consider Inquisitor Severian Holt of the Ordo Malleus, faced with warp breach patterns that slaughtered astropathic choirs across an entire subsector. Standard protocols proved inadequate against threats that shifted faster than conventional response times allowed. Holt petitioned for Grey Sanction authorization, internal writs, permitting otherwise heretical measures under triple seal and subsequent redaction. Under this bureaucratic cover, he bound a demon host to triangulate breach vectors, communing with the very entities he was sworn to destroy, while protective rituals gradually normalized demon interaction. The creature whispered coordinates as blood pooled on sanctified tiles, and 3 worlds were spared as strike teams arrived minutes before warp emergence. Success bred appetite. When breach patterns evolved, Holt renewed his sanction through definitional expansion. The host no longer advised operations but confirmed auspices. Silent notaries stamped renewals while clerks filed reports so heavily redacted that only pronouns survived. Each extension appeared reasonable in isolation while contributing to corruption progression that transformed necessary tool into personal familiar. By the time conclave auditors demanded full accounting, Holt spoke fluent compromise and had developed theological frameworks justifying daemon consultation as Emperor Blessed Divination. Inquisitor Maedra Voke of the Ordo Xenos faced different equations when Tyranid splinter tendrils learned to circumvent Imperial defensive systems through adaptive evolution that rendered fortress worlds untenable. She studied captured Eldar soul matrix geometries to disrupt synaptic resonance, building lattices of waystones and lensed void fields around hive-leading nodes. The trap worked. Synapses collapsed, gaunts wandered, until Imperial artillery processed them into fertilizer. Her success memorandum attributed the victory to classified Mechanicus superstructure, omitting Xeno's provenance to avoid institutional complications. When tech adepts refused to calibrate alien stones for subsequent operations, Voke trained her own artisans under Grey Sanction cover, describing them as priest proxies under provisional chancery. Her laboratory began resembling a cult as apprentices learned to attune psychic crystals through meditation techniques that borrowed heavily from Eldar spiritual practices. Each tactical victory required deeper integration of Xeno's methodologies until her retinue operated more like Corsair warlocks than Imperial servants. Rival Ordos began filing sealed inquiries about what, exactly, she had become, while her battlefield effectiveness continued exceeding sector averages by margins that triggered automated review protocols. The Ordo Hereticus provides its own mirror in Inquisitor Ral Darien, whose recongregator convictions and Istvanian methods created controlled catastrophes for systematic purification. To eliminate a hive-wide cult that had infected the judiciary through decades of careful infiltration, he sponsored a rival creed, fed it scripture written by his savants, and armed it through confiscated manufacturum stock. The theological war that followed killed a third of the hive's population while exposing the original cult's nodes for clean removal. Darien's after-action report read like an accounting ledger: losses, gains, corruption metrics reduced by acceptable margins. When conclave investigators questioned whether he understood the difference between heresy and bait, Darien replied with statistical analysis demonstrating improved sector-wide compliance following his reform. The arithmetic was precise, the mass graves were not. His methods achieved objectives through systematic employment of the very corruption he was tasked to eliminate, creating precedents for larger compromises when circumstances demanded greater flexibility. Each success reinforced confidence in his judgment over institutional wisdom until he began viewing the Imperium itself as another corrupt system requiring purification through controlled catastrophe. Grey sanction protocols formalize these necessary sins through bureaucratic mechanisms that operate beyond normal imperial oversight. Authorization requires tripartite seals. A lord of the relevant ordo provides operational clearance, a designated ecclesiarchal confessor offers spiritual absolution, and a silent notary seconded from the administratum certifies that records can be systematically forgotten afterward. The writ authorizes heretical deeds, binds participants to secrecy, and assigns destruction dates to documentation. Politics wrap around the seals as Puritan blocks tighten eligibility, while radical factions argue that galactic conditions demand broader interpretation. Votes swing with fashion and fear, creating policy inconsistencies that enable corruption through definitional flexibility. The isolation of absolute authority compounds exposure risks by removing normal psychological supports and institutional checks. An inquisitor can requisition fleets, execute planetary governors, or order exterminatus on suspicion alone. Such power demands compartmentalization that gradually separates wielders from the humanity they claim to protect. There are no commissars to question their orders, no chaplains to audit their faith, no administratum clerks to flag suspicious requisitions. They hear only confession and lies from subordinates who worship and fear them in equal measure. The voice in the skull that whispers survival justifies anything becomes the only counsel available when decisions affect millions, but accountability remains purely personal. Internal Inquisition politics create additional corruption vectors as competing factions pursue ideological conflicts through methods that mirror the heresies they ostensibly combat. Doctrinal schisms between Puritan and radical philosophies provide fertile ground for accusations that serve factional interests rather than imperial security. A radical employing Xenos allies might be condemned by Puritan peers not for genuine corruption, but for methodological divergence. Conversely, Puritan rigidity might blind adherents to evolving threats, creating catastrophic failures that represent their own form of heresy against imperial survival. Rivalries mean an inquisitor's fall can result from political maneuvering as much as genuine descent into darkness. Monitoring the monitors relies on recursive surveillance systems that create the very corruption they seek to prevent while consuming vast resources through institutional redundancy. Inquisitor investigators watch other inquisitors for deviation signs, but their investigations require similar exposure to forbidden knowledge and isolation from oversight. The watchers' watchers face identical pressures, while carrying additional paranoia about colleagues' loyalty. Rosette Scrimshaw stores sanction hashes for archival verification, while astropathic traffic carries ghost ledgers of authorized deviations. None of this prevents necessary duplicity. It only delays exposure while making eventual falls more elaborate and absolute. When inquisitors break, they invert rather than rebel like governors or chapter masters. Their intimate knowledge of imperial weaknesses enables targeted strikes against defensive blind spots, while their understanding of surveillance protocols allows extended operation before detection. A fallen Malleus Lord carries exterminatus codes and knows how to blind orbital surveillance networks. A corrupted Xenos radical dismantles interdiction grids and rebuilds them pointed inward. A Hereticus apostate employs second death protocols against rivals, erasing witnesses through administrative acts before bolt pistols speak. They represent intelligence catastrophes that can compromise entire sectors through accumulated secrets, while their corruption provides enemies with detailed knowledge of fortress monastery locations, fleet dispositions, and strategic planning that took centuries to develop. The ultimate paradox emerges: the more the Imperium codifies oversight of its guardians, the more it teaches them where institutional vulnerabilities lie and which systems can be subverted without immediate collapse. Badab syndrome manifests differently within the Inquisition, as excellence in containment triggers suspicion. Suspicion requires grey sanctions to maintain function, and grey sanctions habituate wielders to forbidden instruments until the prohibition itself becomes procedural rather than moral. Saints and heretics become administrative categories separated by wax seals that can be softened with sufficient institutional heat. What happens when the Imperium's ultimate guardians become its greatest threats, possessing both the authority to act without oversight and the knowledge to exploit every weakness in the system they once protected? How does an institution built on secrecy monitor those who know all its blind spots, when the only available watchers are hands already stained by the same sealed writs that authorize the corruption they're meant to prevent? The system that monitors those who monitor everyone else consumes the very resources needed to defend against the threats it claims to prevent. When inquisitors fall, their intimate knowledge transforms institutional weaknesses into enemy advantages, but the greater catastrophe lies in the economic hemorrhaging that occurs before, during, and after each purge. The Imperium bleeds itself through systematic self-surveillance, creating what internal munitorum analyses term the purge tax, the percentage of Imperial military capacity constantly diverted from external defense to internal security operations. Ship-lost days represent the most immediately quantifiable drain on an Imperial effectiveness. During loyalty investigations, entire fleets enter administrative suspension while auditors examine decades of service records for evidence of deviation. The 18-month review of Admiral Korath following his tactical coordination with rogue trader elements cost the Segmentum Solar 47,000 patrol days across 3 battle groups. Strike cruisers idled in dock while clerks verified astropathic logs. Escort squadrons maintained patrol routes but could not engage targets without authorization chains extending to Terra. Pirates exploited the security gaps, raiding merchant convoys while Imperial vessels waited for clearance to respond. Each investigation averages 3,200 ship days lost within 12 months, representing naval capacity equivalent to maintaining an additional sector fleet in constant deployment. Forge line downtime for icon restamping creates industrial bottlenecks that cascade through supply chains with mathematical precision. When the Mordian Iron Guard faced excommunication following Colonel Vex's rebellion, 12 Forge Worlds required retooling to remove contaminated heraldry from existing equipment stocks. Bolt pistols received new grip plates, vehicles underwent complete repainting, and banners were incinerated for replacement with approved generics. Quality control protocols demanded individual inspection of modified items, transforming routine maintenance into months-long processing delays. The production capacity consumed equaled arming 3 new regiments while existing units waited for replacement equipment that bore acceptable symbols rather than forbidden memories. Commissariat manpower diverts from frontline discipline to internal enforcement through assignments that remove experienced officers from combat zones, where their expertise prevents the conditions causing rebellion. Senior commissars with decades of field experience find themselves auditing supply ledgers in archive stations, while Schola Progenium graduates struggle with complex battlefield dynamics their predecessors would have managed through intuition and experience. The Cadian shock troops lost 12 veteran commissars to Badab-related investigations, replacing them with junior officers whose by-the-book approaches contributed to 3 separate mutinies within the following year. Each diverted commissar represents not just lost front-line capability, but multiplied instability, as units lose the steady hands that maintain discipline under impossible conditions. Current estimates place the purge tax at approximately 11% of total Imperial military capacity, according to classified Munitorum efficiency analyses. This figure represents resources equivalent to maintaining 47 additional sector battle groups in constant deployment, excluding opportunity costs from innovation suppression and strategic paralysis, including psychological factors such as officer self-limitation and deliberate underperformance. The total economic impact approaches 17% of military effectiveness, making internal security the Imperium's third largest resource consumer after active warfare and routine logistics. Psychological costs manifest through behavioral modifications that prioritize institutional safety over operational effectiveness. Officers who witnessed Badab's outcome learn to self-limit before review protocols can limit them. Lord General Mordrak of the Silver Skulls deliberately chose grinding attrition over tactical brilliance that might trigger investigation, accepting 12,000 additional casualties during the Xerxes siege rather than employ the orbital coordination that had marked previous heretics for elimination. His methodical mediocrity earned commendation for steady reliability, while the extended campaign allowed enemy forces to reinforce 3 adjacent systems. Such deliberate underperformance multiplies across thousands of commands as capable leaders choose survival over effectiveness. Regiment banner modifications reduce unit identification with potentially heretical figures through systematic genericization that erodes morale and unit cohesion. The Vostroyan Firstborn removed all references to founding colonels from their standards after Badab, replacing personal inspiration with bureaucratic slogans that failed to motivate troops during crucial engagements. Historic honors disappear into abstract language, while specific achievements become impersonal accomplishments attributed to imperial forces rather than named units. Recruitment rates dropped as young men chose regiments with living heroes over units whose greatest warriors had been administratively erased, creating manpower shortages that compounded operational difficulties. Innovation suppression occurs within the same bureaucratic apparatus that detects heresy, creating institutional blind spots that prevent tactical evolution while strengthening enemy advantages. The Tactica Imperialis purged 17 tactical innovations following Badab, including void warfare coordination protocols that had proven effective against pirate fleets. When similar enemies employed those same tactics against Imperial forces, commanders lacked authorized countermeasures and suffered predictable defeats. Technical manuals undergo doctrinal review that removes battlefield adaptations deemed potentially corrupting, forcing commanders to employ obsolete methods against evolving threats, while the innovations that might save worlds disappear into recycling furnaces. Strategic vulnerabilities emerge as external enemies learn to exploit purge cycles through timing coordination that maximizes Imperial weakness during internal enforcement periods. Intelligence analysis reveals correlation between major loyalty investigations and external attacks that exceeds statistical probability, suggesting either extensive spy networks within Imperial institutions or captured planning. Documents that reveal investigation schedules. Orc-Wars demonstrate uncanny ability to emerge during fleet loyalty reviews when naval responses face administrative delays. Chaos raids target sectors, experiencing commissariat rotations when new officers lack local knowledge. Tyrannid splinter fleets probe systems where garrison commanders have been replaced following suspicion of tactical innovation, finding weakened defenses staffed by doctrinally pure but operationally inexperienced replacements. The mathematics are stark and self-perpetuating. Each purge weakens specific sectors in predictable ways while strengthening the bureaucratic apparatus that generates future purges, creating positive feedback loops that benefit enemies more than Imperial security. The Clotian Rift Siege provides stark illustration. When auditors flagged the 9th Chthonian's ammunition efficiency as anomalously high, the regiment was rotated to rear areas for investigation while siege schedules held. Enemy counter-battery filled the tactical silence. Relief arrived 3 weeks later with new chaplains and fewer veterans. The breach that could have been sealed in 5 days cost 4 additional battalions and 2 months of bombardment. The final report termed the delay necessary for institutional hygiene, while the casualty figures matched a small crusade. For every hero eliminated through institutional paranoia, the Imperium loses not only their individual contribution, but also the innovations they might have developed, the officers they might have trained, and the victories they might have achieved. The system consumes its own strength while teaching enemies where and when to strike for maximum advantage. How many potential saviors are lost to systematic distrust before their names can be etched on brass? And what would happen if external enemies achieved full coordination with the predictable cadence of internal purge cycles to maximize strategic advantage during Imperial weakness? External enemies coordinating with internal purge cycles would discover what Imperial archivists have documented across 10 millennia. The betrayals are scheduled. Analysis of excommunications, canonizations, and resource crises reveals patterns that exceed coincidence or institutional incompetence. The Imperium operates on cycles that require heroic destruction as systematically as they demand heroic creation, transforming apparent failure into deliberate policy through mechanisms designed to appear accidental while serving mathematical precision that treats human excellence as expendable inventory. The evidence emerges most clearly during expansion epochs when successful campaigns generate hero surpluses that threaten established hierarchies. The Macarian Crusade created 47 new saints and 317 major heroes within 2 centuries, accumulating independent power bases that diverted resources from traditional institutions while developing personal loyalties that challenged Terra's centralized authority. The Angevin expansion canonized 15 commanders across 2 centuries of conquest, their legends gathering momentum that made bureaucratic control increasingly difficult. Each success bred independence. Each innovation established precedent for further deviation. The mathematics demanded correction. Systematic purges follow with predictable cadence, eliminating accumulated threats while redistributing resources to bureaucratic institutions through loyalty investigations that reset power balances while appearing to address genuine corruption. The plague of unbelief provided convenient justification for harvesting the Macarian epoch's excess heroes through tribunals that reclaimed their accumulated resources for central redistribution. The Badab War occurred precisely when successful chapter masters had accumulated sufficient independence to threaten Adeptus Astartes hierarchy. The months of shame eliminated Grey Knights whose knowledge exceeded acceptable security parameters. Each purge appears reactive while serving long-term institutional stability through elimination of competence that might challenge bureaucratic supremacy. The penitent alleger's true purpose crystallizes through this analysis as a targeting system rather than piety measurement. The miracle-to-tithe ratios were never intended to audit devotion, but to identify heroes whose effectiveness exceeded institutional comfort levels through mathematical precision that flagged dangerous independence. When a commander's legend outpaces his deliveries to common stockpiles, margins turn red. Red margins correlate with visitations, inquiries, and the first parchment cuts that precede elimination. Heroes think they are measured in victories. The institutions measure them in convertibility, in how easily their fame can be transformed back into centralized order through administrative processing. The silent rooms function as factories of institutional amnesia, their production schedules coordinated with political requirements rather than responding to completed investigations. Brass nameplate removal occurs according to predetermined quotas that maintain optimal balance between institutional memory and bureaucratic control. Too much erasure creates knowledge gaps that impair operational effectiveness. Too little elimination allows competence accumulation that threatens hierarchical stability. The machinery operates on mathematical precision that treats individual heroism as raw material for institutional processing, ensuring future commanders cannot study effective responses to impossible situations while perpetuating the doctrinal rigidities that create new heroes and new heretics in endless succession. The tithe-war ratio represents not coincidental correlation, but deliberate policy implementation through supply chain management that creates artificial scarcity during periods requiring heroic elimination. Resource crisis timing correlates with purge schedules as munitorum allocation decisions stress successful commanders until they violate regulations that justify subsequent elimination. Ammunition shortfalls, fuel restrictions, and medical supply delays target heroes whose independence threatens institutional stability, forcing survival adaptations that provide legal justification for excommunication proceedings already planned through administrative channels. The correlation holds across Orpheon, Maelstrom, and Ghoul Stars peripheries, with mathematical inevitability that excludes moral causation. The primary twist emerges through accumulated evidence. The Imperium doesn't fail to prevent heroic corruption, but requires it for institutional survival. Each purge serves multiple functions simultaneously, eliminating accumulated threats while providing moral catharsis for systemic failures and redistributing resources according to political necessity. These cycles act as pressure valves for systemic contradictions that cannot be resolved through conventional means. The Imperium demands impossible loyalty to contradictory principles, obedience to inefficient bureaucracy while achieving tactical effectiveness, submission to resource restrictions while defending vast territories, adherence to rigid doctrine while adapting to evolving threats. These contradictions generate psychological pressure that would explode institutions without regular release through scapegoat elimination. Sainthood and heresy emerge as administrative categories managed by identical bureaucratic processes according to institutional requirements, rather than individual moral status. The same clerks who validate miracles one decade invalidate identical testimonies the next, their loyalty directed toward institutional continuity rather than historical accuracy. Scrivener adept Vex processes saint-making paperwork on even-numbered days and heretic erasure documentation on odd-numbered shifts, her stylus serving both functions with equal efficiency. The Office of Canonization shares personnel with silent rooms through rotating assignments that prevent emotional attachment to either process. Moral interpretation follows political necessity rather than ethical evaluation. The timing choreography reveals itself through coordination between purge cycles and fiscal quarters, pilgrimage seasons, and campaign schedules that maximize institutional benefit from each spectacular ruin. A small censure cannot reset sector power balances. A spectacular fall can harvest multiple needs simultaneously, reclaim resources through seizures, reassert doctrinal primacy, refresh fear in populations dulled by distant wars. By allowing deviation to thicken until it can carry demonstration weight, the conclave triune transforms individual tragedy into institutional theatre that serves bureaucratic requirements rather than imperial security. This system is self-perpetuating and mathematically inexorable. Each cycle generates conditions requiring the next purge while strengthening bureaucratic apparatus that manages the process. Heroes who understand the pattern face impossible choices: serve effectively and risk elimination, or serve ineffectively and guarantee failure. The system consumes excellence while rewarding mediocrity, creating strategic vulnerabilities that external enemies can exploit while maintaining internal stability through systematic elimination of competence that might challenge established hierarchies. The same actions earn canonization during expansion periods and merit excommunication during consolidation phases, with administrative classification depending entirely upon institutional needs at evaluation moments. Can this eternal cycle ever be broken without destroying the institutional structures it serves to maintain, or is heroic consumption fundamental to imperial survival? What represents the ultimate cost of a system that consumes its own champions to fuel the very machinery that creates and destroys them in endless succession? The eternal cycle cannot be broken because it is fundamental to imperial survival, and we return to the empty shrine with this understanding, transforming tragedy into procedure. The nameless statue stands unchanged, its filed features catching ash-filtered light with blank serenity that once suggested loss but now reveals systematic completion. The scorch marks from sanctification rites represent not destroyed sanctity but finished processing, evidence that the saint-making engine functioned according to specification before the unmaking apparatus claimed its scheduled harvest. The imperial aquila gleams above erased identity because institutions endure, while individuals serve allocated functions before administrative recycling. Senior Notary Vex approaches the plinth with practiced steps, her ash-grey robes bearing the crimson seals of expanded authority. Once the junior scrivener who fed brass nameplates into furnaces with mechanical precision, she now coordinates entire purge cycles with the methodical competence that earned promotion through demonstrated excellence at institutional forgetting. Her satchel contains fresh authorizations requiring transformation of inconvenient heroes into useful absences through second death protocols refined across millennia of systematic amnesia. The names change, but the process remains identical, each erasure following templates that convert accumulated independence into recycled resources. The same forge that consumed Huron's legacy operates under expanded charter, its crucibles fed by conveyor systems delivering brass nameplates with mechanical regularity. The penitent ledger's miracle-to-tithe ratios identified their bearers as statistical anomalies requiring correction, their effectiveness exceeding institutional comfort levels according to mathematical precision that treats human excellence as expendable inventory. These metals that once proclaimed heroic deeds melt into standardized ingots before transformation into voxcaster housings, their electromagnetic properties enhanced by trace elements of remembered glory. The devices will broadcast tomorrow's loyalty oaths across 17 sectors, carrying recycled heroism as carrier waves for obedience programming that reaches every imperial citizen through mandatory devotional frequencies. Current heroes understand their position within this machinery through the litany of vigilance, recited during evening prayers with full knowledge of its implications. Chapter Master Korath speaks the words while reviewing ammunition stockpiles that exceed regulation limits by margins, triggering review protocols, his tactical innovation spreading through informal networks that demonstrate dangerous independence. Lord General Mordian recites the litany while studying casualty reports, showing efficiency ratings that correlate with historical purge triggers, his staff rotations including chaplains whose loyalty assessments will determine whether effectiveness represents blessed competence or suspicious deviation. In shuttered chambers, inquisitors whisper identical phrases while drawing grey sanctions from hidden sleeves, understanding that their absolute authority makes them the most valuable targets when institutional requirements demand spectacular demonstrations. The prayer acknowledges their role as temporary stewards of excellence, holding competence in trust until bureaucratic mathematics demand redistribution through administrative processing. They measure success in years of useful function rather than eternal remembrance, praying not for permanent recognition, but for sufficient service before inevitable consumption. The litany's final verse speaks of honored duty fulfilled through willing sacrifice, though the sacrifice involves systematic erasure from history rather than glorious death on distant battlefields. Across the shrine complex, fresh brass nameplates await installation on empty plinths, their surfaces unmarked but prepared for engraving that will celebrate tomorrow's heroes according to templates proven effective through controlled inspiration. The same artisans who filed previous faces smooth now prepare tools for carving new features that will inspire pilgrims until institutional requirements demand removal through processes operating with calendar precision. The plinths endure while occupants cycle through scheduled obsolescence that maintains optimal balance between inspiration and independence, each installation representing both beginning and predetermined end. The Imperium reveals itself as a machine that burns memory to fuel obedience, consuming the very excellence it requires for survival through systematic elimination of competence that might challenge bureaucratic supremacy. Each erased hero enables future heroes through recycled resources and cleared political space, while preventing accumulation of precedents, encouraging dangerous innovation. The human cost extends beyond individual tragedy to encompass institutional learning itself, as successful adaptations disappear into recycling furnaces along with commanders who developed them. Memory serves the state, and the state serves continuity above all considerations. The brass nameplates wait, gleaming and empty, ready for the next cycle of creation and destruction that defines imperial existence through eternal repetition of necessary sacrifice.